Good afternoon, CPAC. Welcome. You're in for a treat here with two very smart gentlemen. You know, I checked my watch on the way out to the stage. Hillary Clinton, still not president. So that's the upside. Hey, listen, we got a fascinating opportunity with the Secretary and the Ambassador now to dig into a topic which before this president, frankly, put a lot of Americans to sleep. Not anymore, because it's one of the biggest games in town. You might say that when it comes to trade policy, President Trump made trade policy great again. Truly. Because he understood how far behind we had fallen because we'd let other people cheat on the system and set our companies behind. And today, we've got a couple of individuals with special titles and special roles who are going to dig more into trade, but also Southeast Asia, some of the things going on that part of the world. So let me start off by first introducing U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. He's the 39th Secretary of Commerce, distinguished business career before he came into government. You know, the mission of the Commerce Department is to create the conditions for economic growth and opportunity, which I think you've done, Mr. Secretary. Appreciate that. And then I will also introduce U.S. Ambassador to Japan, William or Bill Hagerty. 30th U.S. Ambassador to Japan, also had a distinguished business career before going into government. Now he's our representative to the third largest economy in the world, 126 million people and one of our strongest allies. And I don't have 45,000 employees, nor am I a representative to 130 million people. I just host a morning television show. So let's start. Mr. Secretary, let me start with you, your opening remarks.
Okay. You may wonder, how did we get into the trade mess we are? And to learn that, it takes a history lesson. Right after World War II, the U.S. had big trade surpluses, and it was our policy to help Europe and Asia recover from the ravages of war. So we gave direct aid like the Marshall Plan, and we made trade concessions, and that was great. The only thing is they should have time-denominated it, and instead they locked it in with various agreements. So now we're making the same concessions to China, to Germany, to Japan that were very appropriate in 1950 and are very inappropriate in the year 2019. Why do the second and third largest economies in the world need big trade concessions from us? So where we are is locked in. It's a bad situation. 60% of all the items that come into the U.S. come in free of any tariff. 60%. No other country has anything like that. So we are inadvertently the most free trade people. And if everybody were free trade, that would be fine, but they aren't. And that's the problem we're trying to fix.
Absolutely. Mr. Ambassador, you're right in the middle of this conversation as well, obviously.
Well, I am, but I'd first like to just say what an honor it is to be here with you, Secretary Ross.
Thank you, Bill.
I've known you for more than a decade. You're truly one of the great business leaders, the great industrial leaders in the United States, and we're so fortunate to have you as our Commerce Secretary. And the fact that you have such a great depth in Asia. The Secretary was president of the Japan Society before he became our Commerce Secretary. And his insight, his influence have made a huge difference in this administration's policy toward Asia. And I benefit personally from his advice, his wisdom, and his mentorship. So thank you very much. And Pete,
what he doesn't tell you is he was on the transition committee that helped pick cabinet secretaries, and I'm very happy with his choice for commerce.
Indeed.
There you go.
And Pete, it's great to be with you again. I was fortunate to be with you at the Reagan National Defense Forum out in Simi Valley a couple of months ago. You did a terrific job there.
Appreciate it. Your
Your military service, your insight, your enthusiasm and patriotism inspire all of us.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
It's a delight to be here with you. I'd like to also say thanks to Matt Schlapp and Dan Schneider for inviting me to be here, and to our audience, those of you here, those of you who are dialed in. The topic today that we're talking about, what makes America great, is a topic to celebrate. America is a unique nation. There's no other like it. But we're here today to discuss those that would try to challenge our greatness, those that would try to blunt our competitiveness, those that would try to move our jobs overseas. Well, I'm here to tell you, under the leadership of this president, we are bringing our competitiveness back. We are realizing our economic potential, and we are bringing those jobs back to America with a level playing field. You know, Pete, in 2017, the president sent me on a unique assignment. He sent me to what is now the third largest economy in the world, Japan. He sent me there. He sent me back there because he knew I'd lived in Japan before. I lived there in the 1980s. And let me tell you, the 1980s was a very different time in Japan. At that point, Japan had just eclipsed the Soviet Union as the second largest economy in the world. Back in the 80s, Japan was 2/3 of the US trade deficit. If you roll forward to today, China accounts for about 50% of our deficit. And if you think tensions are bad with China today, you should have been in Japan in the 1980s. Secretary Ross will remember this. The United Auto Workers were here bashing Japanese cars with sledgehammers. Congressmen were using those same sledgehammers to smash Japanese radios right over here on Capitol Hill. Japan Inc. was the #1 threat to the United States economy. A lot has changed.
A lot has changed. Well, that new threat to our economy, a geopolitical foe, is Communist China.
Well, that's right.
You talk about fair and reciprocal trade. It's had to take some tariffs. Where are we on that?
Well, first let me explain why it's so important, the deficit with China and what they're doing with it. They're about 300 billion or so ahead of us, counting both goods and services. Over 200 billion of that they spend on defense, so 2/3 of it. Most of the other 1/3 is spent investing in projects in less developed countries, trying to get them into the Chinese orbit rather than ours.
Yep.
And the final bit of it is spent on space. They're trying to develop hypersonic rockets that would be very hard for missile defense to overcome. And they're doing that under the rubric of peaceful space exploration. So it's not just the trade deficit itself is bad enough, but what it enables them to do with the extra cash they're getting in is even more serious.
Well, this administration has linked those two things, trade and national security.
Well, they are linked. They are.
But in the minds of so many Americans in previous administrations, trade was a bit of an abstract. It was assumed we would free trade no matter what, even though there was free loading.
Right.
Right now, Washington and Wall Street are all eyes on the negotiations over
Yes.
China.
Yes.
Take us under the hood a little bit, if you would.
Okay. Well, there are really a few different buckets to the negotiations. The first and easiest one, even though it gets the most press coverage, is the trade bucket itself. It's not hard for China to buy some more soybeans. They buy most of their soybeans from countries other than us anyway. So all they would have to do is switch a few to us. Same with LNG, easy. Same with Boeing. Boeing is a very big exporter to China because they're growing their airports like mad. So that's the easy part. The second part is harder. That's structural reforms. Changing the laws so that there's respect for intellectual property. Changing the practices so that they don't force technology transfers. Changing the behavior so that they don't steal our technology by infiltrating people into companies and into even national laboratories. That's the hard part. But the hardest of all is the fourth and most important piece, and what will prove to be the most contentious with them, and that's enforcement mechanisms. When China was put into the World Trade Organization by Bill Clinton, they put them in on the theory that now they would abide by the rules, but they didn't think to have an enforcement mechanism in case their theory was wrong. So now, 18 or so years later, we have to fix that. We have to have a proper enforcement mechanism. And so what it will consist of is something like the following: periodic ministerial level meetings, periodic vice ministerial meetings, but most importantly, if they can't resolve disputes, particularly about structural reforms, we need the ability to take unilateral action that punishes them, whether it's big tariffs or quotas or whatever we're going to do. We need the ability to take unilateral action. No trade agreement.
You're saying if they cheat, we'll do something about it.
Yeah, we have to have an automatic ability to do something about it. And you'd be amazed how much having unilateral ability to mete out punishment modifies behavior.
Interesting. True, especially when we got a big old military. All right, Mr. Ambassador, I got to ask you. So you talked about Japan then, but Japan today is one of our biggest military and economic allies, certainly in the region, in the world. How did that transformation take place, and how central is Japan to this whole conversation?
Well, if you think about where Japan's located, Pete, we're in a pretty bad neighborhood. Just to the north of us, you've got Russia. To the west, North Korea, and just beyond that looms the shadow of communist China. Things have evolved. We've worked hard on our trade relationship. We have more work to do there. But Japan has become our strongest military ally. We have over 55,000 troops in Japan. We have the only forward deployed aircraft carrier situated in Japan. That's an amazing presence, and Japan is an amazing ally in keeping that entire region safe, peaceful, not only open for commerce, but open for freedom.
Why are they an ally? Why are they such, why do our enemies often turn into our greatest allies? And why in this case is that true with Japan?
As Secretary Ross mentioned, we took a deliberate effort after World War II to work with Japan to bring their economy forward. I had the opportunity to read some minutes of a meeting between General Douglas MacArthur and the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan from 1948. General MacArthur went to the American business people, about 40 of them then at the time, and asked them to reach out to their friends in Manila, to Singapore, to Shanghai, to get them to open their markets to Japan again. We aggressively worked to help rebuild the Japanese economy. We were very successful. I mentioned what it was like in 1980 when I arrived there. So successful that Japan had overtaken the USSR as the #2 economy in the world. But today, Japan suffered through a couple of decades of tough economic times. And I think they've fallen into a much better realization that it's best to work with the United States and work with us in the type of structures that the Secretary mentioned to try to create a set of rules and practices that will facilitate fair trade. We need more reciprocity. And thanks to the Secretary, thanks to Ambassador Lighthizer, Vice President Pence, we're working hard on that, and I feel comfortable that we'll get there. And I think if we do, Japan will become the model for how to deal with China and other nations that need to be brought along that same path.
Yeah, reciprocity being the idea that just because we're open for free trade doesn't make it free trade if the other side is cheating or has tariffs stacked up against our companies. And Mr. Secretary, if you would talk about the state of U.S. manufacturing in America today, I think the fact is 500,000 new manufacturing jobs in the United States since President Trump took office. Optimism of U.S. manufacturers at an all-time high. How did that happen, and what do we do to sustain it?
Well, I think it happened for a couple of very clear reasons. Prior to that, pre-2017, we had lost 5 million manufacturing jobs over the years, 5 million. The way that they came back was, first of all, regulatory reform. Worst thing for business is to be worried about what's going to be the next new regulation that raises your costs, interferes with decision making. One of the first meetings I took when I came into commerce was from a very large mining company in the US. They have what's probably the world's largest copper deposit, open pit deposit, so easy to get out. They've been 10 years trying to get the approvals to do it. They weren't looking for 1 penny of US government money. They just wanted permission to do it. 10 years. Now, not very many managements have the endurance to wage a war for 10 years against the bureaucrats. What we found, I have in my office a gigantic chart. It's much taller than this. It has all the steps that a major infrastructure project has to go through.
I've seen that, Joe.
You know how many steps there are in it? 120. And after almost each one of those 120, there's the ability for naysayers to litigate. That's why it takes so long. In many infrastructure projects, the costs of lawyers and environmental advisors and paperwork people can be as much as 30% of the whole project. So it delays decisions and it costs money. And it isn't just environment, energy. We've freed up energy. As you know, we're now the world's largest energy producer, and we're becoming the world's largest energy exporter. That's a tremendous, powerful development from a geopolitical point of view, because it removes our dependency on a very complicated part of the world, namely the Mideast. It's not that we don't want to be allies with the Mideast, we do, but it's nice not to be dependent on anybody. That's one of the good things energy did. The other thing it did, it brought costs down. Electric utility costs have gone down, importantly because of natural gas. The trade balance is getting better, gradually will get better because of LNG. So it has power. So regulatory was one big thing.
Absolutely.
The other big thing is tax reform. Individual people, tax reform. And I thought it was quite ludicrous that the Democrats were initially complaining that the refunds, the first batch, were lower than they had been a year before. You know why? Because the people got the refunds up front. We cut the rates.
Yeah.
So how would you get more back if you had put less in? Anyhow, so individual tax reform was powerful, and corporate tax reform in some ways even more powerful. The ability to write off capital expenditures is huge. And if you look at the recent gross domestic product figures, corporate investment, both in software and in physical assets, is a big contributor to the economic boom.
Well, and a strong economic hand also strengthens our overall hand with adversaries and trade deals and things like that.
It does. Everything multiplies on itself.
It sure does. Mr. Ambassador, we've only got a couple minutes left here. Even in Japan, I'm sure you see what the fake news media, the left-wing media says about this president and his accomplishments. But from where you sit, as someone in this administration, wrap up your view of how the president is engaging with the world, views the world, and is leading America.
The president is very popular in Japan. I was just visiting Osaka Gas earlier this week, one of the largest gas consumers in Japan. They're going to receive their first shipment of U.S. LNG this year. As the president says, as Secretary Perry is fond of saying, we're not just exporting energy, we're exporting freedom. They're reducing their dependence on Russia, on the Middle East, just as the Secretary said. They are getting a better business model and a better price and a better feedstock for everything that they're doing, thanks to America.
And behind stage, you can clap for that. That's cool. Backstage, you mentioned briefly a story about Nissan, too, a good news story of trade deals.
Terrific news, and my compliments to the Secretary and the leadership of the USMCA, because Japan just announced this week that Nissan is going to move the manufacture of its luxury engines that are manufactured in Japan today are going to move to my home state of Tennessee. That's American jobs. That's more capital here. That's great news.
No, it's the type of intended consequence of you think former NAFTA, Canada, Mexico, you don't think jobs coming from Japan, but that's exactly how it lays out. Mr. Secretary, we've only got about 45 seconds left. Your final thoughts.
Just to pick up on that, the real target that we had with the USMCA was imports from Southeast Asia, because they were the big beneficiaries, because the treaty was originally written in such a way that it had a huge loophole for foreign parts to come in. What they did was they specified individual parts. Well, that was decades ago. Most of those parts aren't even used in cars anymore. So it proved to be a very worthless treaty in that regard, and the percentage requirements were too low and didn't have a specific requirement for high-income areas. We've fixed all that with the new thing, and it's a combination of USMCA and the fear of auto tariffs is why we're suddenly getting these things in.
Pretty nice to have adults in charge, right? Thank you for being here. I'll close by saying, by the way, this is being streamed live on Fox Nation as well, the new online streaming platform of Fox News Channel. If you don't have Fox Nation, you're missing out, okay? It's Netflix for conservatives. I've got a great documentary coming about Jerusalem in a couple of weeks and months, so stay tuned. Lots of great stuff coming on Fox Nation. Ladies and gentlemen, join me, Ambassador Bill Hagerty, Secretary Wilbur Ross. Thank you.